Michael Reynolds leaned back in his sleek leather chair, his eyes scanning the endless stream of emails on his computer screen. His office, perched on the 20th floor of GreenBite Foods headquarters in Austin, offered a panoramic view of the city's bustling downtown. Yet, as CEO, he often felt detached from the very people who kept his company running, people like Sophia Carter. It was a late Thursday afternoon when an email caught his attention. Titled simply, "Request for Leftovers," it came from the company's internal HR system. Normally, such emails were routine, addressing policy questions or minor grievances. But this one felt different. The message was brief, almost painfully humble. "Dear Mr. Reynolds, my name is Sophia Carter, and I work as a line cook at your East Austin branch. I am writing to request permission to take home leftover food from the kitchen at the end of my shifts. My family is going through a difficult time, and this would help us tremendously. Thank you for considering my request. Sincerely, Sophia Carter." Michael frowned, his fingers tapping the edge of his desk. Employees didn't usually email him directly. Most requests were filtered through HR or department managers. Still, there was something about the tone of the message, the quiet desperation between the lines, that gnawed at him. He opened Sophia's employee profile. A 32-year-old line cook, she had been with the company for almost 4 years. No complaints, no disciplinary actions. Just an average worker who clocked in, did her job, and went home. Her salary was modest, as expected for her position, barely above minimum wage. Michael closed the email and leaned back in his chair. The request itself wasn't unreasonable. Plenty of restaurants allowed staff to take home leftovers. But GreenBite Foods had strict policies against it, citing food safety concerns and liability issues. Sophia's request would require an exception to company policy, and exceptions always raised questions. He sighed and glanced at the clock. It was nearly 5 p.m., and he had back-to-back meetings scheduled for the rest of the evening. Yet, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, Sophia's email stayed with him. There was something personal about it, something raw. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. "Ms. Carter," he muttered under his breath, standing up and grabbing his coat. "Let's see what's going on." Without informing anyone or consulting HR, Michael made an impulsive decision. He would follow her after her shift. If she was asking for leftovers, there had to be a reason. And if there was one thing Michael Reynolds believed in, it was finding answers for himself. Michael Reynolds parked his black Mercedes-Benz a safe distance from the East Austin GreenBite branch, his usually composed expression clouded with a mix of curiosity and unease. He wasn't entirely sure why he was doing this. CEOs didn't tail their employees, and this certainly wasn't in the handbook of effective leadership. But something about Sophia Carter's email had struck a chord. A faint, nagging sense he hadn't felt in years. A sense that perhaps he'd been looking at his company through the wrong lens. From his vantage point, he saw Sophia exit the back door of the restaurant, her uniform slightly wrinkled, and her shoulders hunched as if carrying invisible weights. She carried a worn canvas bag, its straps frayed with age, slung over her shoulder. Michael's eyes narrowed as he started his car and followed her at a cautious distance. The streets of East Austin were a stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers of downtown. Here, houses were smaller, older, their roofs patched with mismatched shingles. Rusted cars lined the curbs, and chain-link fences surrounded yards cluttered with toys, bicycles, and the occasional stray dog. It wasn't poverty in the extreme, but it was a far cry from the polished world Michael inhabited. Sophia walked briskly, her head down, as if trying to avoid drawing attention. She didn't have a car, Michael realized. Every step she took seemed purposeful, despite the fatigue in her posture. He followed her for several blocks until she turned into a trailer park on the edge of the neighborhood. Michael slowed his car and parked discreetly across the street. The trailer park was a cluster of aging, single-wide mobile homes, their exteriors weathered by years of neglect. Children played barefoot in the gravel roads, their laughter ringing out like a bittersweet melody against the backdrop of peeling paint and sagging roofs. Michael's stomach tightened. He hadn't seen this side of Austin in years, perhaps ever. Sophia walked up to a trailer at the far end of the lot. The home was small, its metal siding dented, and its windows covered with faded curtains. She paused at the door, adjusting the strap of her bag before stepping inside. Michael hesitated, unsure of what he was expecting to find, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He got out of his car and approached the trailer, keeping a respectful distance as he peered through the thin curtain of the window. What he saw made his chest tighten. Inside, Sophia knelt on the floor with her 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, none older than 10. They sat cross-legged in a semicircle, their eyes wide with anticipation as Sophia unpacked her bag. She pulled out a few plastic containers, the remnants of her shift at GreenBite. Michael recognized them immediately: leftover bread rolls, a small portion of soup, and a handful of wilted salad greens. Sophia's mother, an elderly woman with silver hair and a frail frame, sat quietly in a chair by the corner. She watched the children with tired eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a mug of tea. Sophia divided the food carefully, her hands working with practiced precision to ensure each child got an equal portion. She gave her mother the soup and kept only a single bread roll for herself. Michael's throat tightened as he realized what was happening. Sophia wasn't just feeding her family. She was sacrificing her own meal to ensure her children and mother had enough to eat. The portions were meager, barely enough for 1 person, let alone 5. Yet Sophia's face remained calm, almost serene, as if she had long accepted this reality. The children ate quickly, their hunger evident. Sophia's youngest, a boy no older than 4, asked for more, his voice soft and hesitant. Sophia smiled and handed him the rest of her bread roll, brushing his hair back gently. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Michael stepped back from the window, his heart pounding. He had seen enough. This wasn't just an employee struggling to make ends meet. This was a woman fighting every day to keep her family afloat, sacrificing her own comfort, her own needs, for the people she loved. As he walked back to his car, Michael's mind raced. He had built his career on numbers, on efficiency, on minimizing costs and maximizing profits. But what he had just witnessed couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. It was raw, human, and utterly devastating. For the first time in years, Michael Reynolds felt something crack beneath his cold corporate exterior, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. Sophia Carter sat at the edge of her worn-out sofa, the springs groaning beneath her weight. The trailer was quiet now. Her children had finally gone to sleep, their bellies no longer empty but far from full. She exhaled deeply, closing her eyes for just a moment. In the dim light of the single bulb that hung from the ceiling, the lines on her face seemed deeper, etched by years of fatigue and worry. Her mother's soft voice broke the silence. "Sophia, you didn't eat again tonight." Sophia opened her eyes and turned to the older woman who was sitting in the corner, wrapped in a faded quilt. "I'm fine, Mama." The kids needed it more. Her mother frowned but said nothing. They had had this conversation countless times before, and it always ended the same way, with Sophia sacrificing her share of the meal so her children wouldn't have to go to bed hungry. It had become a quiet ritual, one born out of necessity and unwavering love. Sophia glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight, and the next morning would come far too soon. She had another early shift at GreenBite Foods, and the thought of standing on her feet for 10 hours straight in the sweltering kitchen was already weighing on her. But there was no choice. The job barely paid enough to cover the rent on the trailer, let alone the mounting medical bills for her mother's arthritis and the school supplies her kids needed. Her gaze drifted to the small pile of envelopes on the counter by the sink. Most of them were marked with red letters. Past due. The electricity bill, the water bill, and the medical bills. They all stared back at her like silent accusations. Sophia bit her lip, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill. Crying wouldn't solve anything. She had learned that long ago. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint creak outside. She froze, her ears straining to catch the sound again. The trailer park wasn't the safest place, and she had learned to be wary of strangers wandering through late at night. But when there was no further noise, she shook her head and dismissed it as the wind or one of the kids in the neighboring trailers. Still, a strange unease lingered in her chest. Outside, Michael sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had planned to leave after seeing Sophia feed her family, but something kept him rooted in place. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that he needed to see more to truly understand. He glanced back at the trailer, his mind replaying the scene he had witnessed through the window. The image of Sophia handing her last piece of bread to her son refused to leave him. He had always told himself that business was about efficiency, about results. But now, he couldn't ignore the human cost of his decisions. Sophia wasn't just an employee. She was a mother, a daughter, a woman trying to survive in a world that seemed intent on breaking her. For years, Michael had prided himself on his detachment. He believed that staying emotionally removed from his employees allowed him to make tough decisions without hesitation. But as he sat there, staring at the dim light flickering inside the trailer, he felt the weight of his choices in a way he never had before. He thought about the policies at GreenBite Foods, the strict rules against taking home leftovers, the low wages, the lack of benefits for part-time workers. They had all been implemented under his watch, all in the name of keeping costs down and profits high. And yet, here was Sophia, one of his longest-serving employees, living in poverty, despite working tirelessly for his company. Michael leaned back in his seat, his chest tightening with a mix of guilt and frustration. How had he let it come to this? How had he become so disconnected from the people who depended on him? Inside the trailer, Sophia quietly prepared for bed. She moved through the small space with practiced efficiency, folding the children's clothes for the next day and tidying up the kitchen. She didn't allow herself to dwell on the hardships she faced. There was no time for self-pity. Her life was about survival, about making it through one day so she could face the next. As she turned off the light and lay down on the thin mattress she shared with her youngest son, her mind drifted to the email she had sent earlier that week. She hadn't expected a response from the CEO. He was a man she had only seen once, at a company event years ago. But she had been desperate. If taking home leftovers meant her kids could eat, then it was worth swallowing her pride. Sophia stared at the ceiling, her heart heavy with worry. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up. The bills, the long hours, the constant hunger. It was all piling up, threatening to crush her. But for now, she had her children, her mother, and the faint hope that somehow, things would get better. Michael finally started his car and drove away, his thoughts a storm of emotions. He had seen enough to know that something had to change. Sophia's reality wasn't just heartbreaking, it was unacceptable. And for the first time in years, Michael Reynolds felt compelled to take action, not as a CEO but as a human being. Michael sat in the darkness of his living room, the faint hum of the city filtering through the glass windows of his high-rise apartment. The sleek, minimalist design of his home, pristine white walls, polished floors, and tasteful decor, felt cold tonight. Usually he found comfort in the order and detachment of his environment. But now, it felt empty. His mind was spinning, replaying everything he had seen at Sophia's trailer. Her tired face, the quiet sacrifice as she gave her food to her son, the stack of overdue bills on her counter. They had burned themselves into his memory. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat down, staring out at the glittering city lights. Somewhere out there, Sophia and her family were sleeping in that trailer, surviving on scraps. Michael took a sip of the whiskey, the burn doing little to dull the ache in his chest. He had built GreenBite Foods from the ground up, turning it into a successful mid-sized company that prided itself on efficiency and innovation. He had always believed that profitability was the ultimate measure of success, but now he wondered if he had been wrong. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was an email from the company's CFO, outlining the projected quarterly profits. Normally, such updates filled him with satisfaction, but tonight, the numbers felt hollow. What good were profits if the people who worked for him, people like Sophia, couldn't afford to feed their families? He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had always thought of himself as a fair leader, someone who rewarded hard work and valued loyalty. But the truth was unavoidable now. The system he had created was failing the very people who made it run. For years, he had justified the company's policies as necessary for growth. The strict rules about leftovers, they were about food safety and liability, he told himself. The low wages for kitchen staff, a reflection of market standards. But seeing Sophia's life had stripped away those justifications, leaving only the uncomfortable truth. He had the power to change things, but he hadn't. And that realization cut deeper than he expected. Michael stared at the blank notepad in front of him. He had brought it out earlier, intending to jot down ideas for a new initiative, but the words wouldn't come. He felt stuck, paralyzed by the enormity of the problem. How could he fix this? Where would he even begin? The answer came slowly, like a whisper in the back of his mind. He couldn't fix everything overnight, but he could start somewhere. He picked up a pen and began to write. The next morning, Michael arrived at the office earlier than usual. His assistant Claire looked up in surprise as he walked in. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," she said, holding out his schedule for the day. "Clear my morning meetings," he said, brushing past her. Claire blinked. "All of them, sir?" "Yes," he said firmly. "I need time to work on something important." He locked himself in his office, the notepad from the night before in hand. For hours he pored over ideas, crossing things out and rewriting, trying to create a plan that would address the issues he had ignored for too long. By noon, he had a rough outline of changes he wanted to implement at GreenBite Foods. The first step was simple but significant: a new policy allowing employees to take home leftover food at the end of their shifts. It was a small change, but one that could make an immediate difference for people like Sophia. He also jotted down plans for a company-wide salary review, starting with the lowest paid positions. It wouldn't be cheap, but it was necessary. Next, he drafted the framework for an employee assistance program, a fund that staff could draw from in emergencies, whether it was to pay for unexpected medical bills or to cover rent during tough times. He imagined Sophia's face as he wrote, her quiet dignity, as she worked tirelessly to keep her family afloat. The thought gave him resolve. By the time he finished, Michael felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. He knew the changes wouldn't be easy to implement. There would be pushback from the board, from shareholders, even from his own management team. But he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. Michael leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the framed photo on his desk. It was an old picture of him and his father, taken when Michael was just a boy. His father had been a small business owner, a man who believed in treating his employees like family. Michael had built GreenBite Foods with that same ideal in mind, but somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of it. Now, he was determined to find it again. He picked up the phone and dialed his HR director. "I need to schedule a meeting with the management team," he said. "We're making some changes, effective immediately." The conference room at GreenBite Foods was filled with the low hum of conversation as the management team waited for Michael to arrive. It was rare for the CEO to call an impromptu meeting, and the sudden notice had left everyone speculating. When Michael finally entered, carrying a stack of papers and wearing an expression of quiet resolve, the room fell silent. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady as he set the papers down on the table. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. There's something important I need to discuss with you." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. The team consisted of senior managers, department heads, and key decision-makers, people who had helped him grow the company into what it was today. Many of them looked curious, a few looked wary. Michael took a deep breath and continued. "As you all know, GreenBite Foods has always prided itself on being a forward-thinking, efficient company," he said. "But recently I've come to realize that efficiency alone isn't enough. We've lost sight of something critical, our responsibility to the people who make this company run." There were murmurs around the table, but Michael pressed on. "Last night I witnessed something that shook me to my core. One of our employees, someone who has worked here for years, is struggling to feed her family. She's working long hours, doing everything she can, and it's still not enough. That's not acceptable. Not for this company." The murmurs grew louder, and one of the managers, a man named Greg, raised his hand. "Michael, I understand your concern," he said carefully, "but we've always operated within industry standards. We pay competitive wages, and our policies are designed to minimize risk. Are you suggesting we abandon those practices?" "I'm suggesting we do better," Michael said firmly. "Starting today, we're making changes. First, we're revising our policy on leftovers. Employees will be allowed to take home any leftover food at the end of their shifts. This isn't just about reducing waste. It's about making sure our people don't go hungry." Another voice chimed in, this time from Laura, the HR director. "That's a noble idea, but what about food safety regulations and liability issues? We could be opening ourselves up to lawsuits." Michael nodded, anticipating the objection. "I understand the risks, and I've already consulted with legal. We'll put safeguards in place, waivers, proper storage instructions, whatever it takes. But the bottom line is, no one who works here should be struggling to feed their family. It's a risk I'm willing to take." The room fell quiet as his words sank in. Michael could see the skepticism in some of their faces, but he wasn't finished. "Second, we're conducting a full review of salaries, starting with the lowest paid positions," he continued. "Our goal is to ensure that every employee earns a living wage. This will require adjustments to our budget and may impact our short-term profits, but it's the right thing to do." Greg frowned. "Michael, with all due respect, that's going to be a tough sell to the board. They're already focused on maximizing shareholder value. If we start increasing wages across the board, then I'll deal with the board," Michael interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This isn't up for debate. If we can't take care of our people, then what's the point of any of this?" He could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken doubts and concerns swirling among his team, but he also saw something else, something he hadn't expected. A few of them, like Laura, looked thoughtful. Others, like Sarah from operations, even looked a little inspired. It wasn't unanimous, but it was a start. "Finally," Michael said, softening his tone, "we're creating an employee assistance program. A fund that staff can access in emergencies, medical bills, rent, whatever they need to get through tough times. We'll start small, but over time, I want this to become a cornerstone of our company culture." He paused, looking around the table. "I know these changes won't be easy. They'll require adjustments, sacrifices, and a shift in how we think about our business. But I believe they're necessary. We have a responsibility, not just to our shareholders, but to our employees. If we want to call ourselves a company that cares, then we need to act like it." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sarah, the operations manager, broke the silence. "I think it's a great idea," she said quietly. "It's about time we started putting people first." Michael nodded, gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for your time. These changes will take effect immediately, and I'll be working closely with each of you to make them happen." As the team filed out of the room, Michael felt a weight lift from his shoulders. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. Sophia Carter couldn't believe her eyes. She stood in the break room of the GreenBite Foods East Austin branch, staring at the large announcement posted on the bulletin board. The words felt almost too good to be true. Effective immediately, all employees are permitted to take home leftover food at the end of their shifts. Additionally, the company will be conducting a salary review for all positions to ensure fair and competitive wages. Her hands trembled as she reread the notice, her mind racing. For years she had worked tirelessly, often wondering if her efforts even mattered to the company. She had sent that desperate email to the CEO with no real expectation of a response. It had been a last-ditch effort, a faint hope in an otherwise bleak reality. And yet, here she was, standing in front of proof that someone had listened. "Did you see this?" one of her coworkers asked, walking up beside her. "I heard it came straight from the CEO. Can you believe it?" Sophia shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I can't." That night, as she walked home with a bag of leftovers in hand, her steps felt lighter than they had in years. The bag wasn't much, just some bread rolls, a few portions of soup, and a small container of vegetables. But to her, it was everything. It meant her kids wouldn't go to bed hungry. It meant she wouldn't have to skip another meal just to make sure they had enough. When she arrived at the trailer, her children ran to greet her, their faces lighting up as they saw the bag in her hand. "What's for dinner, Mom?" her youngest asked, his eyes wide with excitement. "Something special?" Sophia said with a smile, her heart swelling as she unpacked the food. For once, there was enough for everyone, and as they sat down to eat together, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. A few weeks later, Sophia received another piece of news that left her speechless. During her shift, her manager called her into the office and handed her a letter. Her hands shook as she opened it, her eyes scanning the words. "Congratulations," her manager said with a smile. "This is part of the company-wide salary review. You're getting a raise." Sophia stared at the letter, tears welling in her eyes. The raise wasn't astronomical, but it was enough to make a real difference. Enough to cover the rent without constantly falling behind. Enough to finally start saving for an apartment in a safer neighborhood. Enough to breathe. When she got home that night, she shared the news with her mother. "We're moving," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I found a place in North Austin. It's small, but it's safe. The kids will have their own room." Her mother reached for her hand, her eyes misty. "You did this, Sophia. You never gave up." Sophia shook her head, a smile breaking through her tears. "No, Mama. Someone listened. Someone cared." As the weeks turned into months, Sophia's life began to change in ways she never thought possible. The new apartment was modest but clean and bright. a world away from the cramped trailer they had called home for so many years. Her children thrived in their new environment, their laughter filling the space like sunlight. Sophia still worked long hours, but the burden felt lighter now. She knew she wasn't alone, that her company had her back. For the first time, she felt valued not just as an employee but as a person. One evening, as she sat on the balcony of their new apartment, watching her children play in the courtyard below, she thought about the man who had made it all possible. She didn't know much about Michael Reynolds, but she knew one thing. His decision had changed her life. Michael Reynolds stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, gazing out at the Austin skyline. The city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling against the dark horizon. It was a view he had admired countless times, but tonight it felt different. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. It had been months since he implemented the changes at GreenBite Foods, and the effects were already rippling through the company. The leftover food policy had not only reduced waste, but had also brought relief to countless employees like Sophia. The salary reviews were ongoing, but the initial adjustments had already made a tangible difference. The Employee Assistance Program, though still in its infancy, had provided critical support to several staff members in need. The board of directors had been skeptical at first, as he had expected. Some had outright opposed the changes, citing concerns about costs and shareholder interests. But Michael had stood firm, presenting his case with unwavering resolve. He had shown them the numbers, yes, but more importantly, he had shown them the people behind the numbers. He had told Sophia's story, and in doing so, he had reminded them all of something they had forgotten, that businesses were built by people, for people. Michael turned away from the window and sat down at his desk. His gaze fell on a thank you card that had arrived earlier that week. It was from Sophia Carter. The card was simple, handwritten in neat, careful script. Dear Mr. Reynolds, thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Because of your decisions, my family has a home, my children have food, and I have hope. I will never forget what you've done. With gratitude, Sophia Carter. Michael's chest tightened as he read the words. He had received countless accolades throughout his career, awards, recognition, praise from industry leaders, but none of it had ever felt as meaningful as this simple card. He leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting to his father's words, spoken to him long ago. Leadership isn't about power or profit. It's about people. If you take care of them, they'll take care of everything else. For years, Michael had lost sight of that truth, buried beneath spreadsheets and bottom lines. But now, he understood. True success wasn't measured in numbers. It was measured in lives changed, in hope restored. As he looked out at the city once more, Michael felt a quiet determination settle within him. There was still so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. Change, he realized, might start with a single decision, but its impact could ripple far beyond what he could imagine.